Well, good evening, everyone. I'm going to work from down here because what you're about to experience is a lecture, not a sermon. And it's a joy and a pleasure to be with you. Just a few words of introduction. I'm not going to take much time at all on that because I need every minute I have to talk about the things I've prepared. Thank you for the invitation, and especially to the elders for providing this. I think it's one of the important things of our time, and you will see why as we go through these lessons. I appreciate your coming tonight. And if there's someone here in the audience this evening that yourself is an atheist or an agnostic, or you're having doubts about God and His existence, I want to thank you for being here because you've opened your heart at least to listen and think about important things. And this is a topic that needs discussion in our time. That's my introduction. I would normally say a lot more than that. Recent polling data indicates that in North America and in Europe, the perceived message of science has played an outsized role in the loss of belief in God. I want to quote to you from several sources in a new book I have that I highly recommend called The Return of the God Hypothesis. We'll come back to this later. But in the beginning of this text, he quotes several polls. One poll said more than 2/3 of self-described atheists and agnostics, and 1/3 of all self-described agnostics affirm that the findings of science make the existence of God less probable. That same survey made this observation: the two most influential scientific ideas that have affected people's loss of faith are the unguided chemical evolution process in the origin of life and the unguided biological evolution in the development of life. So people have said the reason we've lost our faith in God rests heavily upon those two scientific theories. Other polls have shown a dramatic rise in the group of pollsters, in the group that pollsters call the nones. You've heard of this? N-O-N-E-S, the nones. They're religiously unaffiliated people who are agnostic and atheistic. Among college and post-college young people in the 18 to 30-year range, that's the fastest growing group among us. That's why this topic's important. A lot of folks are losing their faith over what they consider to be the scientific answers, and so you don't need God. We could talk many times about that topic, but tonight, tomorrow morning, and tomorrow evening, if God wills, we will have 3 lessons that relate to the topic, is it reasonable to believe in God in this scientific age? And I hope you can be here for all 3, because they really do fit together. And it'll be an incomplete story when we finish tonight that deserves much more attention than we'll be able to give it. So if you cannot be here tomorrow, are you recording this? Okay. I'm asking you to listen to the rest of it and be sure you take that in. Beginning in about 2006, a group of scientists and philosophers known as the New Atheists ignited a worldwide publishing sensation with the following message: science and belief in God are incompatible, and it is a conflict which cannot be resolved. So, the title for my lesson tonight is Christianity and Science, Conflict or Coherence. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse of the New Atheists are Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Chris Hitchens, and they proudly call themselves the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for evolution and atheism. And they are very bold in their proclamations and have affected many, many thousands of people. My title for this series is taken from a book by Dr. Henry F. Schaeffer which I also have here. Science and Christianity, Conflict or Coherence. I'm going to introduce you in this series to a lot of books that I highly recommend if you need to study this more deeply. I'm having a bibliography prepared. It's already ready with John back there. If you're interested, you don't have to write all this down because it's in the bibliography. But this book is by a believer in God. Dr. Henry Schaefer is a PhD in chemical physics from Stanford. He's a world-renowned chemist and is well known for many of his accomplishments. But he also presents lectures on this theme that you see before you on college campuses. He's delivered these lectures in over 200 different schools all over the world. And he presently is at the University of Georgia, where he does a seminar class for college credit on Christianity and science, and very openly proclaims that there's no conflict here. There's coherence, and that it's certainly possible to be a well-renowned and respected scientist and also believe that there's a God. So in this text, he references many people from the past and many from the present who are in the scientific community, who are believers in God. So don't you leave here thinking that because it's such a big problem, so many folks are losing their faith. There aren't plenty of folks who are well-respected scientists who believe in the God of heaven. So this is a good book for you if you're interested in pursuing that further. My goal in this series is to show you there's no conflict, that it's coherence everywhere you look. I have also had the privilege of doing this kind of a series in many places worldwide. Lots of college campuses, and especially in church buildings like this. And I appreciate the opportunity again. It's been a passion of my life, which is now 60 years of doing this. And I feel the privilege every time I get to speak. And I want you to know, since we're doing this in a church building, and most everyone here tonight is a believer, I want you to know I was on my knees this morning praying to the God of heaven, in whom I believe with all my heart, to help me have words to speak that can help satisfy the needs of anyone who's having doubts, and to reinforce the conviction of every Christian. My goal, folks, when you leave here Saturday night, having heard these 3 lessons, is for you to walk out of this building stupefied. You don't know that word? Go look it up. Because I want you to be overwhelmed with the evidence for the existence of God. That's my goal. So thank you for being here. Are you ready for a science lesson? Now, folks, I've asked the elders if I can treat this like a class. So you are my class. And we're going to study a little astronomy. We're going to study a little chemistry, a little physics, and you're going to love it. You understand? And I also do not allow folks to sleep in my classes. And so if I see you starting to sleep, we're going to do something about that. I won't embarrass any individuals, but I don't allow it. Now, I know you probably had a big supper just like I did. And if I were sitting there, I'd probably be falling asleep. But I don't allow it, so I'm going to keep you awake. And one of the ways I do that is I want you to answer my questions out loud, not individually, but as a group. And I'm going to tell you what the answers are. But I want your participation. Are you with me, class? And I love it when you do this with your head. That makes me know you're with me. All right, so in a church building, when I do this series, I start with references to this book, which is the book of Christianity, isn't it? And I'm telling you that in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, in this text of Christianity, which we call the Bible, there are references to the very thing I'm about to do. So we'll start with Psalm 19. If you want to open your Bibles, we'll spend just a minute on this. Psalm 19, verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. What that passage says, class, and I'm going to call you class instead of brother and sister, because that's what you are tonight. That passage teaches that when you examine the natural world, you can see there's a God. Does it not? Yes, it does. And there are others in the Old Testament as well, which we won't take time for tonight. But the key passage to this particular series is Romans chapter 1 and verse 20. I'll read it to you. For since the creation of the world, His, that is God's, invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. What that passage teaches, class, is that you can see God even though He's invisible. How do you see Him when He's invisible? You see Him in the things that are made. And when you see something that sure looks like somebody made that, the conclusion is there must have been a maker. That's the argument. And it's the most famous of all the arguments for the existence of God from the natural world. It's called, in fact, the argument from design. You see, science is about making observations of the natural world. And this passage says, from God's other book, that the natural world can convince you there's a God. Does it not, class? It does. And so the argument from design is what I'm going to use tonight and in the other 2 lessons this week. And it would be the same argument I would use if we did 16 lessons, which, by the way, if you invite me back, we'll do several more. Because there's much more to be said than what we're going to talk about. All right, but for the rest of our time this evening, please take no offense that I'm setting aside this book for the rest of our time tonight. Because God, according to this book, has another book. And I'm going to help you read God's other book tonight. So, we're going to be using this book a lot on Sunday, and I love preaching from that book. It's God's Word. But tonight, class, we're looking at His other book. And that also is a great joy and pleasure. All right. Many of the key scientists in the Age of Enlightenment, the 16 to 1800s, were strong believers in God, in Jesus Christ, and in the Bible. I have a whole lecture on how it is that science as we know it today would never have developed had it not been for Christianity. And by the way, Dr. Schaeffer in this book makes an eloquent argument for that very thing. There are a lot of things about the Christianity, religion, that help support investigation of sciences. And really we're the ones who developed the science as we know it. So a lot of those fellows were firm believers, and of course we're going to use that a lot in the course of this series. And modern science had developed in the context of Christianity. So here's a quote from Dr. Wesley Allen, a historian of science, in his article, A Christian's Vision of Modern Science. Listen closely, class. The conviction that all phenomena of nature should follow a master plan because God has designed the universe according to His perfect character was a central motivation for Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, 4 of the greatest scientists that have ever lived, who lived during this period. Folks, every one of those people who helped foundation of science to be formed were firm believers. There was a God behind all of this. And all we're doing is uncovering it and becoming acquainted with His marvelous works. It's become different from that in the last 200 years, I'm sorry to say. But let's look a little bit at this, just briefly, at these men. Johann Kepler's not as well known as some of the others, but he was a great astronomer and mathematician, by the way. And I wish you had more time to study him. If you want to do this on your own, you want to take a little project on, You'd study Johann Kepler, amazing person. Because back in those days, folks, they didn't have calculators and computers. You had to do math the hard way. Some of you remember logarithms? And you say, He had to use logarithms all the time. It was a tedious process. Anyway, I love the man. He was amazing. But look at what he said. I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him. Since we astronomers are the priests of the highest God in regard to the book of nature, it benefits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our minds, but rather above all else of the glory of God. Don't you love that? He also went on to say, and God has chosen to speak to us in the sciences, in the natural world, in the language of mathematics. So if this were my math class, what I would say to you, class, is you'll never be closer to thinking God's thoughts after him than you would be in my calculus class. Because in calculus, you're studying infinity. And how do you get closer to God than to try to analyze infinity? And mathematics class has become the deepest and clearest expression of the way the natural world works. And it is an incredible story how much of math was developed in the minds of men and later came to be shown that it was a perfect explanation for things you observe in nature. How is that possible? It's because the mind who made us in the first place was a mathematician class of the superb degree. And a scientist, by the way, of the greatest degree. All right, so Johannes Kepler, amazing. But even more amazing is Isaac Newton. Now, how many of you in here know anything about Isaac Newton? Well, please tell me you've heard of him. Okay. He's only the most important scientist ever lived, in my opinion. And I'm going to try to convince you of that in just one little page here. We could write pages about this man. He independently invented the calculus, only the most important subject you'll ever take, if it's math and science related. Not only did he learn how to do it, he invented it. And folks, the calculus has answered more practical natural problems than any other topic in mathematics. I don't say that lightly. He formulated the classical laws of motion. He invented and applied the universal laws of gravitation. Surely you all know that. And he mathematically described the relationship between the force of gravity and two masses and the distance between them. First one to ever do that. And it stands to this day, although it's been expanded upon by Einstein and his theory, but his fundamental theory still stands. And he built the first practical reflecting telescope. He pioneered studies of light and optics. Folks, what he did in light and optics has founded a whole series of sciences. And he theoretically determined the speed of sound. How do you do that? If we had time, I'll tell you. But I could list, folks, 6 pages like this of what Isaac Newton has accomplished. And that man, in his most important work, the Principia, said the following: though these bodies, talking about our solar system, may indeed continue in their orbits by the mere laws of gravity, and by the way, if I interrupt the quote here, his laws of gravity helped men later tell ahead of time about planets we hadn't seen yet. How powerful it is. These bodies may indeed continue in their orbits by the mere laws of gravity, yet they could by no means have at first derived the regular position of the orbits themselves from these laws. Thus, this most beautiful system of sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being, and he capitalized B. And it is said about Newton that he very likely spent more time studying that book, the Scriptures, than he did the natural world. So I present to you only the most important scientists that have ever lived, all of whom were faithful believers, not only in God, but in his Son, Jesus Christ, and that the Bible was his word. I don't know how you feel about that, but to me, that is a powerful foundational point to be made. And Dr. Schaeffer expands upon that for lots of other folks, both then and now. And then in the early 1800s, there was a course that everybody in college took. It was called Natural Theology. And see what it says? The evidences of the existence and attributes of the deity, collected from the appearances of nature. Charles Darwin took this class. William Payne wrote this book. It's a famous book from the 1800s. And Charles Darwin was convinced, having taken that class, that he was going to be a preacher. He later changed his mind and became a naturalist, and of course lost his faith and gave us this terrible theory that has affected us more than any other thing than except the Bible, I think, in very negative ways. But he started out to be a preacher based on the evidences of the natural world. And I appreciate William Paley's efforts. And at the beginning, he makes the famous watchmaker argument, and you've probably heard that one. So I'm not going to take time tonight to tell it to you. I'd love to do it. I'd love for you to be in my class as Dr. William Paley. Now, I'd even speak a little British to you. But he would start his class by saying, what if you kicked a stone across a heath and you picked up and there was a watch? What would you think? And of course, everybody's answer was, you examine that watch carefully, you can see all of the characteristics of it. Somebody made this. This is not just like a rock. And then he proceeds to tell you there are things in the natural world much more complex than any watch that all show the same kind of evidence for somebody made this. Only nature is much more complex and involved than any watch. And so I want to present you, he would say, to the real watchmaker, the God of heaven. Well, again, I apologize to Dr. Paley and a whole lot of others for not giving more attention, but there's more to be said. So here we are in 1980, class. How many of you were alive then? Thank you, makes me feel better. You remember the Cosmos series? That's the most popular science series ever been on television. Taught by Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was a professor at Harvard University in the 1950s and 60s when I went to school there. I'm telling you this only because I want you to know I have lived through what I'm talking to you about and lived it as a science student, sitting at the feet of folks like Carl Sagan. I never had him as a professor, but he was at Harvard when I was there. And his Cosmos theory started with this statement: the cosmos is all that is, or all that it was, or all that ever will be. In other words, there is nothing but the cosmos. And of course, what follows from that, if he were teaching the astronomy class, is you folks in this audience, students, who have been taught by your parents and many others, there's some God out there, some mystical being. You need to get over it. Because the cosmos is all there is. And that was a common theme in the 1960s and continues to this day on the parts of some. I want to tell you that there's more recent Cosmos series than that. It's called Cosmos, A Space-Time Odyssey by Neil deGrasse Tyson in 2014. Any of you ever see that? Nobody. Well, okay, you did. Good. Wasn't nearly as popular as Carl Sagan's, but it was the same message. And by the way, he started that series in 2014 with the same sentence. Ladies and gentlemen, that sentence is not science. If you're in my class and I stop like that, that means I just said something really important. And it'll be on the test. That is not science. That's philosophy, is what that is. Science in no way could tell you that. And to make such a blatant statement in a science setting is a desecration to science, because that's not science. That's philosophy. But that's the mix-up we get, you see. And by the end of the 20th century, Sagan and a host of others like him, and I already mentioned to you the four horsemen of the apocalypse of new atheism, one of the most outspoken is Richard Dawkins. Born in 1941, still alive. He's the British evolutionary biologist and author, professor of public understanding of science at Oxford. I will tell you that Oxford made up that classification for him because they wanted him to represent the sciences to all the world. So for you common folk, like me, common folk, he's the one that's supposed to tell us how science works. He's the professor of the public understanding of science. And may I say to you, in my humble opinion, you can study after him and make your own judgment. He is one of the most biased representatives of what science is supposed to be that I've ever seen. And also kind of hateful. In fact, he's plain mean sometimes. So I want to show you some examples. In his book, The Selfish Gene, 1976, faith is blind trust, the absence of evidence. Even in the teeth of evidence, it's a process of non-thinking. So class, if you're in this class and you are a believer in God, that's what he thinks about you. You just believe it without any evidence, and you just accept it no matter even if the evidence is all against you. That's his perception. That is completely wrong. Faith described in the Bible is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith in the Bible is founded upon evidence. Always. So he's completely wrong about that. And then, The God Delusion, 2006. This is the book that kind of set it on fire, the new atheist movement. And in that book, he said, if this book works as I intend, religious readers who open it will be atheists when they put it down. And I can assure you, class, if you're not aware of this, many professors on many college campuses are in the business of helping you become an atheist. And they make no bones about it. And Dawkins is one of the worst. So he wrote a book hoping to convince you that the only reasonable position is atheism. And here's another quote from that book. God is a delusion, a psychotic delinquent invented by mad, deluded people. I say that's not very nice. And I am such a person. And so are you here if you're a believer. He says to you, God is psychotic, and you helped invent him. I say that's not very nice. Neither is it representative of what science ought to be doing. But that's what we're getting in the 20th and 21st century. So how did things change so radically in 200 years? We went from Kepler and Newton saying, you ought to glorify God, not men. You know what people do today in the scientific community? They glorify themselves for what they've discovered, instead of glorifying the God who made it in the first place. So how did that happen? Well, I'm going to give you the fastest history of science course you've ever had. At Harvard, I determined that I was going to study everything I could put my hands on that supported belief in God. I couldn't find anything worth reading written by creationists. You listening to me? In the 1960s. Harvard has 65 libraries. The Widener Library on the main campus is the central place. Only students, professors, and those who are given special permission are allowed in those stacks. So you can be assured I was there every day. I couldn't find anything worth reading by creationists. We've come a long way, folks. Now, I have 5 pages of bibliography of wonderful books you can read, many of them by creationists. Overwhelming, good, solid science. How did those changes take place in 200 years? Well, briefly, While I was there, I took a course in the history of chemistry, one in the history of mathematics, and one in the history of biology, all as extra courses over on top of the regular curriculum, because I wanted to get in there and dig into what the masters did. You see, when you study the history of science and math, you go back and read the original documents, and you learn what they were talking about and what it meant. You also unfold what was happening. Pierre Simon de Laplace perceived himself as the second Isaac Newton, and he was far from it. He was asked one time by, I understand, the Prince of France, why don't you ever mention God in your materials? And he said, nature with its matter, energy, and forces could produce and maintain our solar system. There is no need for a God hypothesis, he said brazenly. No need. He said the positions of the planets not only are maintained by gravity, but they could have been started by the normal forces of matter without any God. Charles Lyell, in the early 1800s, wrote a very famous book then called The Principles of Geology, an attempt to explain the former changes in the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. 3 volumes, you see. Charles Darwin also read that book. And his philosophy was, anything you see in nature that's geological formation could have been explained by the natural forces that happen every day. Just give it enough time. So you don't need God in geology either. And then Charles Darwin came along in 1859 is when he first published his infamous book on the origin of species. And he took the position that there's no need for a designer to account for the origin of species of life. You may not know that in the 1800s the standard position was God created every species just as they were and where they were. That was standard. Darwin began to question that from his observations and became to believe natural selection, acting on natural variation, accounts for the appearance of design. They look like they're designed, but they're not. They come about by natural causes. Natural selection has become their God, folks. They believe it can do almost anything once you get life started. I want you to see something before we leave this. Can you see the subheading to his infamous book? The origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservations of favored races in the struggle for life. And I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that in the 1900s, when Hitler came along, he loved this book. Because his view was, my Aryan race is favored, and the Jewish race is not, so we will eliminate them. And why not? If you believe this theory, would that not support it? And not only evolutionists, but lots of other folks who went along with it. And not only Jews, but other kinds of folks you didn't want, like ones with weaknesses and poor minds and fallible bodies. Because you don't want those kind of folks to breed and pollute the next generation. So there was a whole eugenics movement class. Did you know that was happening in the United States of America at the same time? Numerous famous scientists, I can quote you, who believed in eugenics, which means killing off people who shouldn't be on procreating. You see, class, science doesn't give you the answers to morality. In fact, if you take it in its purest sense, it leads you down the path of natural selection. So how did things change in 200 years? People began saying this stuff. And in the early 1900s, O'Perrin and Haldane came up with a theory that you don't need God to produce life from non-living matter either. And that's another 2 whole lectures, which I will not do tonight. But that theory came to be propounded and is widely believed to this day. Didn't I read it to you from just a moment ago? The chemistry, the origin of life by itself. Folks believe it. I say, class, it's time to revisit the argument from design. So for the next period tonight and tomorrow night, that's what we're going to do. So, how you feeling, class? You getting sleepy? I don't know. I'm not so sure about some of you. It is a little warm in here. Are we not getting air conditioning? I may take this jacket off, but not yet. All right. Class, I want to recommend 3 books to you. Stephen Meyer's trilogy. I think he's the best creationist writer of our day. So he's written a book called Signature in the Cell. I'll refer to that tomorrow. He's written a second one called Darwin's Doubt. It has to do with the origin of life itself, and Darwin always had a doubt about how that could have happened. And the fossil record doesn't support that. And then his latest book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. That's a takeoff on what Laplace said back in the 1800s. You need to return to the God hypothesis. And in this book, he gives 3 scientific discoveries made in this past century and this century, class. I'm here tonight to tell you that you've been involved in a civilization in the last 70 years that has learned more about life than in all the time before that. Did you hear what I just said? You've been here living through it as we've discovered how life functions at the biochemical level especially. What we've learned, class, from science, not the Bible, is that space, matter, and time has a beginning. Now, folks, atheists generally don't want to hear that, because either matter's eternal or God's eternal. And now you can't say matter's eternal anymore, because science has demonstrated it's not. I'm not talking about that topic, but it's in that book, and it's got references to lots of others if you want to go study it. But the facts are, class, that the evidence from science says this universe had a beginning. That's problematic for an atheist. Secondly, the universe, our solar system, and the earth are remarkably fine-tuned to support life on earth and have been since the beginning. Fine-tuned. That's what I'm going to talk about tonight, just briefly. And then the third thing is, even the simplest forms of life at the biochemical level contain massive amounts of digital information being used to produce and maintain an untold number of molecular machines and complex processes. I just lost you, didn't I? There's a lot of complicated stuff down at the nano level. That's what it's saying. Down inside every living thing. I mean, massively complicated. Don't you miss Saturday night, because I'm going to talk about molecular machines that are better than anything any humans ever produced. And they're doing stuff in your body as you sit there listening to me in micro and milliseconds. And we've only learned that in the last 50 years. So, these 3 things, he argues, are sufficient to return to the God hypothesis. And they haven't been learned until this century and the immediately preceding one. So I'm happy to tell you, class, that's our topic, especially numbers 2 and 3. So here we go. Fine-tuning. I start with a very famous book by Paul Davies. Paul Davies is an evolutionist through and through. Don't be mistaken. In my series, I like to quote the evolutionists themselves. So this is Paul Davies. He wrote a book called The Goldilocks Enigma. Why is the universe just right for life? You see why he called it Goldilocks? All of you know the Goldilocks story, right? Kids in this class? Where are kids? There you are. You remember Goldilocks? Yeah. She went into the woods, didn't she? And went into a house and found at the table, help me class, 3 bowls of, yes. So she sat down at the first place and took a little bite of that, and it was too hot. So she went to the next one, tested it, and it was too cold. So she went to the third one, and it was just right. Now, class, that's the answer to my question for the next 10 minutes. Just right. Because what we've learned, class, is that nature is just right for us. And the more we've learned, the more powerful that gets. One of the most significant facts, arguably the most significant fact about the universe, is that we are part of it. Would you agree? I think so. How did you get here? Everyone agrees the universe looks as if it was designed for life. It's pretty brazen for a guy like that to say everyone. What I'm going to tell you over the next couple of days is not anything people disagree on in the scientific community, whether they're evolutionists, atheists, or what. We all agree on the evidence. And what it is it sure looks like it's designed. They just try to say, well, it wasn't designed. It was just a coincidence. It was a result of natural causes. But everybody knows it looks like it was designed. The really amazing thing is not that life on earth is balanced on a knife edge, but that the entire universe is balanced on a knife edge and would be total chaos if any of the natural constants were off even slightly. You get that? And I'm telling you, class, there are hundreds of those things that we've learned about in the last 70 years. So, eyes up here on me. Imagine here's this machine. We're going to call it a universe-making machine. And it has dials on it and sliding things. Lots of different ones. And every one of those dials and slides has to be adjusted in order to have life. And the universe as we know it. And once they're adjusted, what we've learned is you change any one of those, one teensy little bit, and none of this would be here. Don't believe me, class. You go read Paul Davies and lots of other folks. It is a fact. We have learned that there are hundreds of things that have to be, say it. That was very weak, class. We have learned that there are hundreds of things that have to be just right. Thank you. In order for you to be here. So I want to run through a few. And we're going to run because we're running out of time. In the 1960s, when I was in school, we had discovered 12 characteristics that were fine-tuned. 12. By 2020, at least 50 books had been written documenting the anthropic principle. From these books, Hugh Ross and his staff have cataloged over 800 fine-tuned characteristics as essential for any potential human life site in the observable universe. Now, class, if you're in a jury and you have 6 different coincidences that all are needed to explain this, or the guy killed him, then how many coincidences can you put up with? Okay? That's the question. Because in the natural world, this guy says there are over 800. I don't know about that number being exact, but there are hundreds of factors that all have to be, say it, or you wouldn't be here. So what are some of those? I introduce you to one of my favorite books, God's Crime Scene by J. Warner Wallace. A cold case detective examines the evidence for a divinely created universe. This guy is a cold case detective. His daddy was too. And his daddy was an atheist and went, as far as I've heard, he still is. But J. Warner Wallace is not. He's become a believer. And it's because of the evidence that convinced him. So he's using the methods of a detective to examine the universe. And he's considering the universe his crime scene. You need to get this book. Those of you that have children, please. So I'm going to share with you a little piece of chapter 2. Because every chapter that he writes is built on a case that he solved as a detective. I'm going to be brief on this one. Helen knew something was wrong when her daughter Carrie failed to answer the door. It was a bright summer afternoon. Carrie said she'd be home. Her car was in the parking driveway. Helen tried to peek in through the living room window, and the curtains were drawn. She never locked the back door, but when Helen walked to the backyard, the old home, she found the door locked and all the windows closed. This was not like Carrie. She usually left one badly worn rear window slightly ajar. Not this time. Helen began to panic. She knew Todd and Carrie had a tumultuous marriage, one that included physical violence. Todd had moved out, but Helen still feared for her daughter's safety. You see, the couple had a child named Lexi. But the violence had only intensified since her birth a week ago. Since her birth. A week ago, Todd had threatened to kill Carrie, and just last night, Carrie confided there'd been yet another fight. She told her mama. When Helen couldn't get Carrie to answer the door, she called the police. And that marked the beginning of the case. Folks, nobody saw what happened when the police got in and found 2 dead bodies. Carrie and Lexi were dead on their beds. So how did that happen? Well, he makes an argument in here. He said the reason they had to be a detective is because there were 2 dead bodies. How did that happen? That either was a natural phenomenon that happened by natural causes or somebody messed with something. So then he says, like our murder scene, there are foundational, regional, and locational conditions demanding explanation. How did we living people get here? And so he looks at 3 lines of evidence. And by the way, Carrie's husband was convicted of first-degree murder on circumstantial evidence because it was overwhelmingly in favor of his conviction. There was nobody there when God created us, was there? But can we be convicted that there is a God based on the circumstantial evidence, if it's powerful enough? Yes, we can. And that's the thesis of this book. I highly recommend it to you. And so, he talks about, among other things, the laws of nature, the physical constants, the ratios, the elements, and the chemicals. Lots of those have things that have to be, say it, exactly. And that means, how just right does it have to be? How about 1 over 10 to the 37th? That's 10 with 37 zeros after it. If you change it that much, you wouldn't be here. There's a bunch of those. How about the proper type of galaxy? You think just any old galaxy works? No, class. We've learned very well it's not just any old galaxy that can support a planetary system with life on planets around it. Not going to happen. So I want to take just a minute here and explain to you a little more about galaxies. And I want to do it by showing you a picture taken by the James Webb Space Telescope in 2022. It's the first picture released from this telescope, which you all have heard the stories about in the news, haven't you? It's the most important telescope ever put up, and it's seeing things farther away than we've ever seen. Now, look up here, class. NASA's publication about this picture I'm about to show you says if you took a grain of sand and held it out here at arm's length, closed your eyes, and thought about how much of the sky is blocked out by that grain of sand. Are you with me? The amount of space blocked out by that grain of sand as you look through it is what this picture is of. Okay? Did I make it clear? What you're seeing is just that much of outer space. Okay? Lights off. Thank you. Remember, that's the size of a grain of sand if you held it out here like this. None of this had ever been seen before. Let me point out some things. Look, see these globs here? You say, look at those amazing stars. Plus, those aren't stars, those are galaxies. That thing right there is an irregular galaxy. That's another one. That's another one. That's another one. That may be globular or elliptical, but anyway, it's another galaxy. Look at this one. Can you tell that that's a spiral galaxy? Yeah, good. Thank you. He's got better eyes than some of you. But that's kind of looking head on at a spiral. You see it? And there's another one over here somewhere. Let's see, where is it? Right there. That's another spiral galaxy. But most of these galaxies in here are either globular or elliptical. And by the way, class, we've discovered in the last 50 years that globular and elliptical galaxies cannot support a planetary system like ours. It has to be a spiral galaxy. Guess what kind of galaxy we live in, folks? We live in a spiral galaxy. Well, that's just an interesting coincidence, isn't it? It's just the right kind of galaxy. This is the galaxy cluster SMACS 0723, about which we knew nothing 10 years ago. Are we surprised, class, as believers in God, that there are lots and lots of stars? Not at all. Because God says He made them. Not surprising. But folks, most of those stars and those galaxy systems in that picture cannot be useful for discovering where life came from, or that could even support life. It has to be a spiral galaxy. So there's one up close. And by the way, it's not just any old spiral galaxy. It has to be a spiral galaxy that is... That's right. There are a lot of things different about spiral galaxies. Some of them are barred, some are really tightly woven, and some are not. It has to be... Yeah, it's not just any old spiral galaxy, class. All right, next. Where you are in the galaxy matters a whole lot. Here's a galaxy that's spiral, but you're looking at it from the side. You see that glob in the middle? If the sun was right there with its planets around it, it wouldn't last 30 seconds. There's too much gravitational and electrical forces. Thank you for turning the lights back on. No, guess where they have to live? Where would the sun have to be with its planets? Watch. One of those two places, either here or here. Guess where our sun is? Right there. Just happens to be in exactly the right place in the spiral galaxy, far enough away from that central glob, a little bit off the level. There's all kinds of reasons why it's important. It's where it is. That's 6 more lectures. But it has to be exactly right. And that's not good enough. You think just any old star will do, class? No. Here's our sun. And here are the planets. Of course, the sun's a whole lot bigger than our planets, but look at the sun now compared to Sirius and Pollux and Arcturus. Sun is rather small, but I'm not finished. How about this? There's Arcturus, Rigel, Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, and Antares. And where's the sun? It's right there. Can't you see it? I can't either. It's 1 pixel on that picture. So, class, our sun is not by far the largest star out there. In fact, it's a pretty average star. You know, there's a whole lot of stars smaller than our sun. They're called dwarf stars. Lots and lots of them. In fact, our sun is almost smack dab in the middle. So it is. We just happen to be around a just right star. But class, it isn't just its size. It's its temperature. It's the kind of radiation it puts off. It's about 16 other things, which is 3 more lectures. But when you get all finished with it, in all those characteristics, it has to be exactly right. Yeah. Good, you're doing well. Is it good enough just to have a sun? No, you got to have planets. And it's not just any old planet, folks. Do you think we can have life on Jupiter? If you think so, you need your head examined. So there's our planets in our solar system, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. These are so large, there's all kinds of reasons there's no life on those. Here's the Earth. What's this one that's closest to the size of the Earth? No. What is that one? Venus. And this one is Mars, and this one's Mercury, and this one's Pluto, which is still a planet. Depends on who you talk to. Are we looking for life on Venus, class? Nobody is, because it's a kind of a messed up planet. It rotates the wrong way. It has too slow a rotation. It has atmosphere that's mostly sulfuric acid, not good for living things. So nobody's looking on Venus. Where are we looking? Mars, because there's some basic evidence that there might sometime have been some, what? Water there. And we're covered up with it. How about 70% of the Earth's surface? And Mars, you can hardly find evidence for any. But we're looking. The planet has to be not only in size and shape, but in its location around the sun. It's called the habitable zone. And the Earth, Venus, and Mars are the only ones in that zone. Venus is out. Mars is pitiful. We have one. You think that's all, class? No. It's mass, spin, tilt, moon, atmosphere, crust, etc., 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 etc. And it's the properties of the biochemicals on the Earth, the cells, the genetic code, the molecular machines. That's tomorrow, class. Don't you miss it. And the cell is the classic illustration, and it's down here on the nano level. Anybody know what a nanometer is? I will tell you, it's 1/billionth of a meter, if that helps you. A meter is about this long, a little more than a yard, right? Take this long and divide it up into 1 billion equal parts. And one of those parts is a nanometer. Kind of small, isn't it? Did you know we're doing science at the nano level right now? There are folks who major in nano engineering. And I want to introduce you to one. This is Dr. James Tour, professor of chemistry, materials science, and nanoengineering at Rice University, world-renowned. He's a Messianic Jew. You know what that is? That's a Jew who's come to be a believer that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. And if you go to his website at Rice University, he has in there a description of why you should become a Christian. And he said the key to that is believing that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. And he has a whole list of reasons why you should believe that. Don't you love it? A world-renowned nanoengineer who unabashedly declares his faith in Jesus Christ. And this guy's done amazing things. So among his other feats, he's helped use graphene. That's one layer of carbon thick. That's impossible. But we've done it, and he's helped us learn how to make that stuff better and some of the things to use it for, like how about this little guy? He took a mouse and cut his spinal cord, severed it, which is not helpful for a mouse. And then he inserted in the cut some chemical materials and paste and some graphene and turned the little rat loose in the enclosure. Within 23 days, he was running. Somehow, that started healing that spinal column. Anyway, who knows where that's all going to lead? But he has a bunch of patents developed for the medical field based on nanoengineering. So when they were doing all that work, they decided, well, why don't we do something fun? So let's make a nano car. So here, class, you see a picture of the first nano car. There's its wheels, and there's its axle. This is the driving rod here. And all of that is made out of one molecule. How do you do that? Very difficult. But several others have been trying it. In fact, they're competing with each other. And of course, if you build a car, what do you got to do with it? You got to race it, of course. So I'm glad to tell you that on April 28th and 29th of 2017 in Toulouse, France, was the first international nano car race, which they did under the guidance of computers. And these little cars run around on foil, and you have to direct them. You can move them by either light energy or chemical energy. And so they had a race. And entered into the race were Austria, US, University of Graz, and Rice. This is our team right here. France, Germany, Japan, Switzerland, and another small university in the U.S. called Ohio University. And I'm very happy to tell you, class, that when that race was done, the United States team with Austria won the thing by going 150 nanometers in 1.5 hours. Remember how big a nanometer is? He went 150 of those in an hour and a half. I mean, that's whipping along, right? At the molecular level, that's whipping along, class. And by the way, what about the other guys? Switzerland came in second at 133 nanometers in 6.5 hours. And the rest of them gave up. I'm telling you, class, it's hard to make a nano car and make it work right. So I'm not going to talk about that one, but he had to go through 2 or 3 generations of building nano cars. And by the way, each time he had to start over. So here's what he says. The nano cars built by Rice University team were much smaller and less complex than Keynesian and Dynean walkers and other molecular machines common in every living cell. He's saying, my car was nothing compared to what's in every cell in your body. The Rice team has been working on nano cars for over 20 years. Every molecular machine in living cells is much larger, at least 10,000 times, and much more complex and much more sophisticated than anything humans have ever built. Here is a taste, class, of how much work and intelligence it took to produce a nano car. Everybody wake up and get your eyes up here on the screen, because I'm going to show you the first page. By the way, after Dr. Tour and his team won that thing, everybody said, would you share with us what you've learned? He said, of course. And so, there's the first page. I will pause and let you read that. Got it? Okay. How about page 2? But there's more to this, class. That article that he wrote was published in Tetrahedron magazine, and the date is right over here. Can you read it? May 17, 2017. That was 1 month after that race. They had already written this, obviously, and he put it in a public magazine and shared it with everybody. But notice over here on this side, 281 pages of supplemental information. All of them like those 2. Well, there are pictures in some of them with drawings. Would you say it took a little bit of intelligence to produce a nano car? So here's a reasonable conclusion, class. Nano cars were built by intelligent human engineers. Anybody want to argue with that? Nobody with half a mind would argue with that. Living cells with all their thousands of nanomachines, which are far more intricate, complex, interdependent, and full of digital information, were surely designed by someone far more intelligent than these human engineers. Surely. Can Christianity and science coincide? The Bible teaches things which were made cause us to see God, doesn't it? Romans 1:20. Science says everywhere we look, from the macroscopic to the microscopic, things sure look like they're made. Behe would say they look like they're designed, and they are. Christianity and science agree, and it's more reasonable than ever to believe in God. And we're just getting started. But that's my lesson for tonight. Thank you.